Welcome to the BJOG workshop that we're conducting. And I thought what we'll do is we'll run the workshop in two parts. I'm going to speak on about how to get published and what editors are looking for in manuscripts that are submitted to us. And my colleague Elizabeth Hay, who is the managing editor for the journal, will talk about what added value you can get from BJOG. So as you can see from the slide, I work as a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist at Nine Wells Hospital, but my main interest is in gynecology. So I tend to handle most of the gynecological papers in BJOG. For my presentation, the overview would be that I thought I would introduce you to the BJOG team, talk about the peer review process, talk a little bit about what you should do when you submit papers, what you should not do, give you some information about some resources that are available to help authors to write papers, and also to talk a little bit about scientific misconduct. So the BJOG mission for us is essentially, we are very keen to try and report the best possible research in women's health, as well as to try and internationalize the team, the journal itself. The journal team is actually consists of, as you can see on this slide, Lizzie, Louisa, and Dave. And they work, Lizzie and Louisa work from the college, which owns the journal, and Dave works from home. The editorial team is led by our editor-in-chief, who's Khalid Khan, and he's based in the UK, and the three deputy editors, as you can see, Mike Marsh, myself, and John Todd. Of the three editors, John is from the USA, and this is again part of the ethos within the journal, where we want to try and internationalize the journal by having our editorial team from all over the world. And below the three editors-in-chief, we have a total of 36 editors. And as you can see, the editors come from all over the world, including China. And we're very grateful that we have Juan Zhang, who is from Shanghai, as one of our editors. And within the editorial board, we also have two other individuals from China, which is Duo Zhan, and as well as Zhen Qin Lao from Hong Kong. The editorial team, as you can see, is mainly based in the USA and Europe, but there's a fair number of members from all over, from other parts of the world. So in terms of the editorial process, what normally happens is that authors would submit their manuscript to our website, which is bjog.allentrack.net. And the document management system, which is Allentrack, will then submit your manuscript to the BJOG editorial office. Within the editorial office, we do what we call an initial quality check, whereby we look for whether your manuscript complies with the format required for the journal, and whether the abbreviations is appropriate before it's then handed down to one of the three deputy editor-in-chiefs. So in my case, I tend to deal with most of the gynecological papers, and what I then do is to look at the paper and do an initial assessment on it and to decide whether we think the paper is likely to succeed for publication. Now, we receive approximately 2,000 submissions a year for publication, of which, unfortunately, we only have space to publish approximately 20% of these papers. So the majority of papers actually don't end up being published by us, and in that situation, we like to provide the authors that decision as soon as possible so that we don't waste any time for them with the editorial process. So as the deputy editor-in-chief, I would then decide whether the paper gets rejected, or I then allocate it to one of the 36 scientific editors that we have. So at the initial quality assessment stage, what we tend to do is to look at whether, as I said earlier, whether the manuscript complies with the layout and the style that we're interested in the journal. whether there are issues with trial registration, and whether there are basically missing sections such as the disclosure of interest, funding, and ethical approval. All this information needs to be present before we can actually process the manuscript itself. In the next slide, I'll show you that all this information is provided in our instruction to authors, and I would advise you that you read through this very carefully before you put in your submission. In terms of poor language and outside the scope of the BJOG, that tends to be decided by the Deputy Editor-in-Chief after it's been gone through the editorial office. So this is the website for bjog.org.uk, and within that, there's a little section that gives you the instruction to authors. If you click on that, that gives you a link that then opens up a different web page whereby you have all the full instructions to authors for different types of manuscripts. So this is an important web page that I would urge you all to read before you submit your paper, so that as little time is spent on trying to correct all the manuscripts. So once the Deputy Editor-in-Chief has decided that this paper is worth to be processed further, we then allocate it to one of the scientific editors. And the scientific editor will then have another look at the paper and again decide whether it will likely to make the cut for publication. The difference is that with scientific editors, they tend to be selected on the basis of the special clinical interest they have. So for example, if it's an oncology paper, it will go to a scientific editor who normally works as a gynae oncologist. And at that stage, he or she may advise the Deputy Editor-in-Chief as to whether this paper is likely to make the criteria for publication. If not, they will then initiate an electronic consult over the internet to discuss with the Deputy Editor-in-Chief, and if the advice is that it should be rejected without further review, then again that decision is then conveyed to the authors. On the other hand, if the scientific editor feels that this paper merits some further consideration, we would then send it to at least 2 reviewers. Sometimes we may even have 3 reviewers, depending on whether we require statistical review as well. So the 2 clinical reviewers will look at these papers, and they will provide a report to us, and they will also provide a recommendation. The recommendation generally is either we consider accepting this paper, usually with some revisions, or we reject the paper. So if the 2 reviewers are unanimous in their recommendations that it gets rejected, usually the paper doesn't proceed any further. In some unusual circumstances, the editor could overrule the reviewers, but that's not a very common situation. What's more likely, if the paper were to proceed any further, is where you have a split recommendation for the 2 reviewers, or both the reviewers recommend that we should accept it with some revisions. At this stage, an electronic consultation is then set up again by the allocated scientific editor, whereby he or she will consult with at least 5 or 6 other fellow editors, including the Deputy Editor-in-Chief and the Editor-in-Chief. And the editor will basically provide a little resume of the paper itself, what it's intending to say, what is the clinical importance of this paper, and the findings in the results, and also give a short summary of what the 2 reviewers have said, and then provide his own personal recommendation as well. So at some stage after a consensus view, the paper is either then rejected or accepted, or more commonly accepted with some revisions, either minor or major. And then those revisions are then resubmitted back to the allocated scientific editor to have a look. And if he or she is happy with those revisions, eventually we then accept it for publication without any further revisions. I have to say that the when the paper, we try to minimize the number of papers that get to the rejection after consultation, because the time spent and the effort spent to get to this stage is quite considerable, and we like to try and minimize the time for authors to get the decision as soon as possible. So in terms of what are the reasons why manuscripts get rejected from publication is are as follows, as you can see on this slide. Sometimes the topic addressed within the study is clearly outside the scope of the BJOG. For example, in BJOG, we do not publish audit because it's not science, and we do not, up to now, publish clinical guidelines simply because usually they're published elsewhere within the literature world. Some topics are also too specialized. For example, BJOG has a policy that we like to try and publish manuscripts where they have an immediate clinical impact, so which means that it usually refers to clinical trials or systematic reviews. But some of the very specialized laboratory-based topics are considered outside the scope for the journal. Rare conditions are also usually not published by us, simply because most of our audience are unlikely to encounter them. So things like case reports are not commonly published within BJOG. If we feel that the topic addressed by the study is also too localized and there's not much of an international interest, in keeping with the ethos that I mentioned earlier, where we like to internationalize the journal, again, we tend not to accept them. The other common reasons for rejecting papers are usually down to poor study design, or whether the statistics are not robust enough to provide to generate a strong conclusion, or the study numbers are too small. Quite often, some of these studies are just too small to provide any conclusive evidence. And we also not uncommonly find that sometimes authors overstate the results so that the conclusions is not justified by the study. But usually this could be overcome with if the authors are prepared to revise the conclusions. So the review process normally takes about 3 weeks. As I say, we normally pick 2 reviewers, and we give them approximately 3 weeks to provide a submission. It's all done electronically, and after a few days, if we don't hear a response from them as to whether they're willing to review the manuscript, we send chasers out. When the reviewers submit the report, we also each editor will also provide a rating between 1 to 5 as to how high quality the report is. So 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. And after several review submissions, we also have an average rating so that we know who are the better quality reviewers. We also monitor our reviewers from the time they spent in providing the review for us. So obviously we want reviewers who give us a very high rating, but also in a very short time interval with their reports. In terms of the consultation process that is undertaken by the scientific editor, again, this is done electronically through our website on AllenTrack, and as I said earlier on, the scientific editor will give a resume of the paper with all its weakness and its strengths, and we normally have to include at least 5 to 6 editors together with the deputy editor-in-chief or the editor, and as well as the editor-in-chief, and the length of the consultation can vary. Sometimes it could be as short as 1 or 2 days, sometimes it could be 2 or 3 weeks. We try to aim as short as possible. In essence, the policy is that in order to get a decision to accept the paper for publication, we need 6 yes votes. And this could include the 2 reviewers itself. So if the 2 reviewers were to recommend support publication, you would need at least another 4 editors to say yes, together with the deputy and the editor-in-chief. If there are 4 no votes, then the paper that will not be accepted for publication. So you can see from this slide, the criteria for acceptance for publication is much stricter compared to getting rejected. It's far easier to reject a paper than to accept it for publication. And this is based on the fact that we have far too, the number of papers that we can publish is only 20% of all the submissions that we get. In terms of what editors and reviewers don't like, we have to try and look for things like duplicate publication. Obviously, that doesn't serve any purpose for reporting science, and sometimes it can be misleading because some of these studies get counted twice in systematic reviews, and that could skew the results of a systematic review. The other issue for the journal is there's an issue with copyright as well. So once we publish any article that's published elsewhere, theoretically, we could be pursued for breach of copyright publication copyright from the other journal. So we have to protect the journal by trying to spot things like duplicate publication. There's also been issues in the past with the journal with things like guest authorship and ghost authorship. Ghost authorship is when names are included in the paper where they are not aware that's been done, and guest authorship is when they've been offered authorship where they've not contributed to the paper whatsoever. In any case, this is considered to be scientific misconduct, and in keeping with our code of ethics, we would obviously try and discourage this, and if this is spotted, we also would not publish that paper. Conflict of interest is important. You'll see shortly what you need to what we like you to declare, whatever potential conflicts of interest you may have. Fabrication of data is obviously a desirable thing to have, and together with falsification. So if these things are detected or reported to us, we take them very seriously. Most of the studies on human subjects with any intervention require ethics approval. Again, we would want your ethics approval. We would need to see the reference for the ethics approval, and you need to report whether that's been provided. In the next few slides, I'll also talk about unregistered trials. So from 2005 onwards, all clinical randomized control trials need to be registered prospectively, i.e. the registration has to be done before you recruit the first patient into the trial. It goes into a centrally held register so that the protocol is held there, and the advantage for that is that other trialists can see whether a similar trial has already been conducted or about to be conducted to avoid any duplication of the same trial. As far as the journal is concerned, if there's any question about the integrity of the protocol of the submitted manuscript to us, we can also double check it with the original protocol lodged with the trial register. We try and discourage the use of acronyms because obviously they can mean different things to different people. And we also try and avoid repetitions or the overinterpretation of data, i.e. type 1 errors, where you tend to claim that an association or a cause and effect exists when the real situation there isn't that association. So if you have a very large study, then a lot of your p-values will be statistically significant just by chance alone. As I mentioned earlier on, we don't tend to publish audit, we don't publish guidelines, and case reports are also very rarely published in a journal unless they've never been reported before or there's an important education message from the case report itself. So these are the list of things that you should try and avoid, or at least be aware to that the undesirable things that we want in a journal. In terms of writing the paper, you would need to have a structured way of doing it, and this is a recommended structure for BJOG. We normally want a title page, we want an abstract, and the abstract is also structured, as you'll see shortly, and we want an introduction, the methods, results, and discussion. And the last few bits are quite important: acknowledgement and references, things like the disclosure of interest, things like the role played by each individual author is also important. You'll see shortly. So what I want to do from now on is just to talk a little about each of these subsections. So in the abstract, as I say, is structured, and the reason why we want it structured is because it has to be limited to only approximately 250 words. And the purpose is that most of our audience do not read the whole paper, they just read the abstract. If they're interested in what they read in the abstract, they may then go on to the full manuscript. So it's important that the impact from the abstract should be as high as possible to provide as much information as possible without the authors having to read through the whole papers for every single paper. So the abstract is structured onto having a section on the background, the objective, the setting, the study design, some description of the subject or the participants in the study, the interventions involved, the main outcome measure, the main results, and the main conclusions. It should be completely standalone. And this is an example of an abstract submitted to us. And you can see in the top section under the objectives, the authors have actually written down the objective, and then instead of reporting any primary outcome measures, the first thing they report is the secondary endpoints. So when an abstract comes in like that, we would re-edit it, and we do it using the tracker tool on Microsoft Word, because the documents all come in as Word documents. And as you can see, we would change things for them, and we would create a second subsection called outcome measures, and within that they will have the main outcome measure, so that it's straight away, you can tell what's the primary outcome measure for the study, as well as the secondary outcomes. And you can see the abstract has been shortened quite considerably with our tracker change. We also try and keep some of the formats. For example, in BJOG, we quote the mean with the standard deviation in brackets. So little things like that, we would edit it to make it comply with the format that we normally employ. The introduction should only consist of approximately 400 words. And again, this is our instruction to authors. And essentially what you want to do is just to explain why the study was undertaken, and a bit of a background knowledge to the issues involved, such as the interventions and the condition that you're studying on, and why this study has to be done. Perhaps sometimes maybe there's paucity of data in the literature. Perhaps whatever is published so far, the studies are not robust enough, there's deficiency in the study design, and that's why you need to undertake this study. So this is that's the only information that we require in an introduction. We don't really want a long introduction or a systematic review of the literature, because space is important for the journal. The more pages we publish, the less articles we can publish. And we don't need, and a lot of the things that you say in the introduction needs to be referenced. And at the end of it, you should also state the objective of the study. In terms of the discussion and conclusion, again, it's fairly structured within articles for BJOG, for the original articles. So in a discussion, which is limited to approximately 1,200 words, we want you in the first paragraph to say what are your main findings. So within the discussion, we have several subheadings. The first subheading will be the main findings, which is essentially the summary of what your study is trying to show. And then the next subheading will be the strength and limitation of the study. So you need to be open and be prepared to acknowledge what are the limitations to the study, because most studies have some element of limitation, and sometimes it's unavoidable, but it needs to be transparent to the readership so that they're aware of it. And the same applies to the strength. Obviously, if it's large studies, the enormity of the database sometimes is the strength itself, and you need to highlight that. We also want you to interpret your data with evidence published elsewhere. How do your findings compare with the results from other studies, for example, to see whether there's the the relationship that you found in your study is strong enough or robust enough or believable enough. Within the conclusion has to be fairly short, but it has to be able to tell us a little bit what are the implications, what are clinical implications for the intended readership. Because our journal is a very clinical journal, whatever is published, we normally expect that it will have some implications for clinical practice. So that's what we want the conclusion to say. And as well as any implications or research recommendation for future research. What are the unanswered questions there are for further research that needs to be addressed. In terms of the resources for authors, what we also, within the BJOG, we like to highlight this particular website called the Equator website, which is on www.equatornetwork.org. And you can see on the web page here, it gives you the whole list of all the recommended guidelines for reporting. So for randomized control trial, you would use the consort. And you can see in the previous page, not only does it give you a checklist for all the things that you have to report for a randomized control trial, but also the consort flow chart as well. And a similar type of guidelines to reporting has also been reported for other types of studies. So PRISMA refers to the reporting for systematic reviews, STROKE for observational studies, STAT for diagnostic studies, and then qualitative research is CORAC and NRAC, and then CHEERS is for health economic evaluation and so on. Even for case reports, there are also guidelines on how you should write up a case report. In terms of scientific misconduct, I've already highlighted early on that some of these things are shown on the slide here. So if you have any conflict of interest, it needs to be declared. If you don't declare it, it raises suspicion as to whether there is any bias, deliberate bias in the results that you're trying to report. So you'll see shortly there's a slide on what you should declare. Disputed and ghost authorship is already mentioned early on. Plagiarism, which is also been mentioned, and we also look for things like that through various tools that we have on the website, which I'll talk about shortly. Duplicate publication has also been mentioned. Salami publication is when you try to analyze data using as a secondary analysis. Now, sometimes secondary analysis is justifiable because at the time when you conduct a study, you may not have deliberately collected data for a particular hypothesis. It's only after you publish the main findings, you have a secondary hypothesis, and then you would use your data to try and answer this hypothesis. On the other hand, if that was already planned from the very beginning, then ideally all that should be reported with the original first publication. You shouldn't try and string all your data out into several publications or as many publications as possible just to increase your publication list. We'll also talk about data fabrication and falsification early on, and this has happened before with some of the papers that are submitted to BJOG in the past. Informed consent is important, especially when there's any case report, and we tend not to publish case report without informed consent. And as I mentioned earlier on, ethics approval is also a requirement, especially where there is any clinical interventions on human subjects. When it comes to the declaration of conflict of interest, what authors should do is to try and state in writing whatever financial relationships they may have with any particular organization. And for example, so this would include things like any organizations you might work, that you've written the guideline, or any drug company that you may hold some shares or directorships within it. It is not forbidden that you can't have any potential conflict of interest, but you must declare it. So transparency is what is required here, that we try and provide as much information to the readership in order for it to decide whether your work is believable. So sources of funding of your work should also be declared, and things like any employment, as I say, stock options, share ownership, patent applications, that all has to be declared at the end of the manuscript, as you'll see shortly. And this is really just to share the information with the readership. It is also important that all the authors should have full control of all the primary data. So if you are using data from another source, you must have permission from that source to use the data, or they are part of the authorship. Obviously, if there's any conflict of the ownership of the authorship of the data, that potentially can lead to potential reporting of scientific misconduct. In terms of what constitutes authorship, we feel that authorship should only be granted for when the following criteria from A to D are satisfied. So, first of all, each author should be either have made a contribution to the design of the study, the collection of the data, the analysis of data, and the interpretation of the data, either all or any of these four things. Together with each author should also have taken responsibility in the drafting and the revision of the authors, so that to make sure that intellectually the content is valid and correct, and that you give final approval to the final version to be published. And also that if there's any questions in relation to the integrity of the research work, that all the authors also share the responsibility in addressing those questions. So in our manuscripts, you'll see shortly, there is a section where each individual the role played by each individual author has to be declared. As far as the corresponding author is concerned, his or her role is really to accept the full responsibility of all the contributing authors, and that has to be done by signing an authorship responsibility and disclosure form. If the corresponding author also has to certify that the manuscript represents the original and valid work and it's not been submitted anywhere else to another journal, to avoid any duplicate publication. And if there's any request by any third party to scrutinize the data, then the corresponding author is responsible in providing this data. Sometimes the data is actually asked in order to undertake a systematic review, or such as an individual patient systematic review, and authors are obliged to provide that data. And then you have to obviously confirm that each of your authorship team has satisfied the criteria for being justified as an author and given approval for the submitted version of the paper. Usually, once the manuscript has been accepted for publication and it's gone to be typeset, the final proofreading is usually undertaken by the corresponding author on behalf of all the other authors. I talked earlier on about plagiarism or duplicate publication. So the main issue here is that obviously you will skew information published in the literature by publishing things twice, especially if the data is used more than once in any systematic reviews. And from the journal point of view, we have an issue with potentially being challenged for breaching intellectual copyright. Within the journal, what we do is when a paper is accepted for publication, before the paper is being published, we will undertake certain tools to look for evidence of double publication. So there are all these websites, as you can see, as well as tools such as Authenticate, whereby we can put chunks, we can copy and paste chunks of the manuscript, post it on a website, and what this website will do, it will interrogate various databases, such as Medline, PubMed, for example, and look for similarities between those chunks of part of the manuscript that we posted with other manuscripts that are published elsewhere. So you can see on the right-hand corner here, there is a similarity index. What you want is index to be as low as possible. Anything up to about 15-20% is acceptable. Once it gets higher, then we become a little bit worried about where the duplication is. This particular software also tells us where the duplication is. So quite often what we find is that authors sometimes, because authors tend to publish work on the same topic with different types of studies, they sometimes tend to quote their own papers, and they try to copy significant chunks of their own work from one paper to another paper. Now, although that the intellectual rights for the original paper resides with the author, it also resides with the original journal. So the two papers are submitted to two different journals. Potentially, each of these journals could still dispute the copyright between themselves. So for this reason, we want to try and avoid, we want to keep the similarity index as low as possible. And that sometimes means that you have to use different words, even just to say the same message. Data manipulation involved with things like, for example, if the statistics are not fully checked, where the data is not normally distributed, for example, and you use a parametric analysis, statistical analysis. So things like that are usually can skew the conclusion itself. It's important that obviously non-normally distributed data should be analyzed with non-parametric statistics. The other interesting issue is how you deal with outliers, whether you include them or you leave them out. And another common issue for us is the prior power sample size calculation for randomized control trials, because potentially these things could be altered to suit the recruited sample size. And that's one of the reasons why we want trials to be prospectively registered, because we can always doubt, if there was some doubt about your sample size calculation, we can always look at your original protocol to see whether there's any discrepancy between the two power calculations reported. In terms of figures that are submitted, we want original figures or original pictures as much as possible, because nowadays with electronic publishing, you can obviously alter images electronically quite easily, and especially with some of these gel films for basic science research, that could skew the data quite significantly. And so if there's any manipulation, electronic or digital manipulation on digital images to improve the clarity, it would be better if it's declared at the time of submission. We talk about informed consent already, and we'll also talk about registration. Informed consent is mandatory usually for case reports, for example. But the other issue that I want to sort of spend a few minutes to talk about is prior trial registration. So since July 2005, most biomedical journals require clinical randomized trials to be registered prospectively, i.e. the registration is done at the time of conception of the trial before you recruit any patients into the trial. And obviously this is to avoid any publication bias, so that when anybody doing a systematic review, they know those studies have been conducted. Even though they're not reported, they can at least approach those researchers and ask for the data, provided the trial has been executed and completed, in order to avoid any publication bias in the review itself. This policy has been in place for at least 10 years now, and in BJOG, if that's not done, usually that might be a reason not to proceed or to accept the manuscript for publication. So, and just to show you, this is the statement from a committee of medical journals, and this includes quite a few reputable journals in the world, and they came out with a statement just prior to July 2005 to say that all trials need to be registered prospectively. Even systematic reviews nowadays also require prospective registration. I mentioned early on that in all our manuscripts, at the end after the conclusion, there are several important sections, such as the disclosure of interest, the details of ethics approval, and funding. So this is the section where you need to put all this down, and also if there are any acknowledgements whereby you may wish to acknowledge some individuals that will help you with the conduct of the study, but they do not justify authorship, then you would include it into the acknowledgement section. So in summary, what I hope to show you is that we want the journal to have an international dimension, and we do this by having an international team working. We also want to disseminate the results from all over the world to an audience all over the world as well. And this initiative in trying to start a Chinese supplement is part of this work stream. What's also important to us is that the articles we publish are robust, and for that we require a robust and efficient editorial process. The reporting has also got to be structured, and we try and comply with all international publication ethics. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to pass on to my colleague Lizzie Hay, who's going to then talk about what added value you can get from BJOG.
Thank you, Patrick. Sorry, I'll just get my slides up ready. Okay, thank you for staying with us for this author workshop. As Patrick mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Hay, and I'm the Managing Editor for RCOG Journals. So not only am I Managing Editor for BJOG, but also TOG, which is the CPD journal from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. I'm going to quickly summarise how BJOG serves our authors beyond the article level in promoting the papers, enriching our content, and making sure that our content is disseminated as widely as possible to the correct audience. So you'll see from this slide we do this through a number of ways. We enhance the value. We encourage you to use your work for continuing medical education. We help you disseminate your work widely, as well as optimising the accessibility of your articles through digital means. So I'll go through each one of these points just with a little bit more detail quickly before we go on to questions and answers. So we like to enhance the content in the journal, and we do this in a number of ways. Firstly, we very often publish mini commentaries which appear alongside articles. These are short articles written by an expert in the field to provide an alternative view or perspective to the content of the article. And these are very popular as they summarise the topic very quickly and encourage readers to read the full article to see what the topic is all about and what the research is that the commentary is based on. More recently, we've launched a new series called BJOG Perspectives, and within this series there are a number of streams, including BJOG Debate, which summarises conflicting perspectives, so we have a for and against argument, BJOG Inspired, which includes personal perspectives on how BJOG content has inspired clinicians in their work and professional careers. We also have BJOG on the Case, which summarises medical legal cases, and we try and link this back to content on similar topics. And also BJOG Since 1902, which really promotes the prestigiousness and how old the journal is. So we've been around since 1902, and we really like to just highlight the impact that our research has throughout the years. We also offer authors supporting information. So this is extra content that we can host online only, rather than taking up space in the print journal. We can offer authors to upload further tables, figures and data sets, which allows you to publish more online, which we would otherwise have to restrict you publishing if we only printed in print rather than online. We also encourage you to disseminate your work, and we do a number of things to help you do this. So every month we choose 2 papers to press release, and this is a concise summary of an article is sent out to journalists to cover in their various media outlets, and this can include online news, papers and also blog posts. So you can see here one of our examples is a press release about a commentary which we published regarding the high caesarean delivery rates in China. So this helps us disseminate our research worldwide beyond the UK. We also publish a number of podcasts. There are currently 10 podcasts available at www.bjog.org, and we hope to make this a more regular feature of the journal as we look to enriching our digital content throughout this year and beyond. We also publish a number of themed issues and special supplements. So as part of the main volume of the journal, we have a themed issue every January, and this is free to view for 3 months to encourage more downloads for the papers. And this means that typically they will receive 50% more citations. And you can see on this slide some of the topics that we have included so far. And this is an opportune moment just to highlight to you that we currently have a call for papers for a special supplement which we want to publish next year, which is all about women's health in China. So this includes anything regarding to policy and practice in women's health in China. And you can see from the advert here that the deadline for submissions is the 31st of October this year. So please do consider whether or not you have any content to publish in this supplement. We're very proud of our social media presence. Over here in the UK and America we have Twitter and Facebook, and we have recently, very recently, launched a Weibo account. So you can see here at the front that we are now posting updates of the journal via Weibo, and we really encourage you to sign up and follow us. So everything that we post on Twitter should feed through to our Weibo account now to further our reach to China. Our publishers Wiley have also got a Wiley China blog and an Asia blog, which brings context to research published by their journals to the China audience. So again, we really encourage you to follow these posts, as we do include some news on these blogs as well. For particular issues, we do have bespoke marketing campaigns. So for the Women's Health in China supplement, which I just mentioned, you can see here that we have sent out a bespoke newsletter, translated this into simplified Chinese. We also have print adverts, and of course our website is a great resource for keeping up to date with what's going on with BJOG. More recently, we've been looking at how we can encourage readers to use BJOG for their continuing medical education. And for some time now, we've had a journal club, which includes particular papers that we've selected to put together some discussion points for readers to use within either face-to-face journal clubs and more recently via social media. So our journal club papers, as you can see, have discussion points which are put together by our journal club coordinator, and we also ask authors to put together a slide set summarising their paper so that in journal clubs it's easy for the presenter or the host to quickly summarise the paper and get the discussion going as quickly as possible. We have a special page on our website where all of our journal club papers can be found easily, and this includes links to the PowerPoint slides which I mentioned, as well as the discussion points. We have recently launched a social media journal club. It's currently available on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn, but we are very keen to promote this on Weibo as well, so watch this space for when it will be available on Weibo. But it would largely follow the process that we're currently using on Twitter, in that we make a special journal club paper free to view via social media for 1 week before a scheduled discussion. We have a journal club host who takes participants through the journal club discussion points which come with the paper, and then we capture responses from people all over the world for 7 days before summarising the discussion and publishing this in BJOG Exchange, which is our correspondence section. So it allows us to provide a really nice post-publication feedback loop for authors as well as readers on what people are saying about our papers. So as I mentioned, it's currently on Twitter and Facebook, but we will be looking into launching a similar structure on Weibo soon. Also, another way in which we promote continual professional development or continuing medical education is publishing CME questions in our sister journal, TOG, which is the Obstetrician and Gynaecologist, another journal owned by the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists. And here we have a specially selected CPD editor who monitors our papers through the system for those which would be suitable for CPD questions. If a paper is picked, then we will approach the author to write some questions, and then these are moderated by our CPD editor before being published in the Obstetrician and Gynaecologist. And so far we've had really good uptake on these questions, and we're really pleased that people are using BJOG papers to further their professional development. So moving on how we can increase the accessibility of your work, in addition to the means that I've already covered, such as social media, we have an iOS app which is available for iPhone and iPad, and we're really hoping that the Android version will be available later this year. So do watch out for that if you have an Android device rather than the iOS devices. And we also have an enhanced website where an enhanced HTML is available now for readers, which is a responsive design to respond to the device that you're reading our papers on. So if you have an iPad, then it will display the size of the screen of the iPad, and likewise for phones, there will be a special format for phones so that it's easier to read on the small screen. We also collate papers into special virtual issues, and these issues appear online only. They're a collection of papers which highlight a particular theme. So recently our editor-in-chief Khalid Khan visited China and visited our editors based in China, and for this trip we made a special Chinese virtual issue which is still available online, and this includes papers that we have published in the past which relate to women's health in China. So do look at that. We are also a hybrid open access journal, and this means that after 12 months all of our content is free. In addition to this, we pick one paper a month to be free to view, and we call this the editor's pick. In addition, we have journal club papers, which I mentioned before, we make free to view for the discussion. And if you are required to comply with open access mandates, then we follow all the rules, so you are able to publish your work at open access as required. So here is just a summary of all the ways in which we help you wider disseminate your research and help you get it the most exposure as possible. Again, I will just mention the China Special Supplement, which is coming out next year, and it's open for submissions until October this year. So please do have a look at our website at www.bjog.org, and you'll see an advert there for the call for papers for more information. Thank you very much for your time.